It's important to remember the lessons of the past to build a better future. Now let's continue the part 2 of our story.
Of course, Gerald didn't answer. The dead never do, no matter how much we wish they would. But sitting there in the quiet, I felt a kind of peace settle over me. I'd done what I needed to do to protect myself and my assets. The legacy Gerald and I had built together. I'd set boundaries, enforced consequences, and refused to be manipulated. Those weren't the actions of a vindictive person. They were the actions of someone with self-respect, someone who understood that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. It's just enabling. And I'd enabled Brandon enough by raising him without holding him accountable for treating his mother with basic respect and decency. When I got home, there was a car in my driveway. My heart jumped with alarm until I recognized it. Brandon's silver sedan, the one Gerald had helped him pick out 10 years ago. Brandon sat on my front steps, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard my car, and I was shocked by his appearance. He'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. His face was haggard, his eyes red and swollen, his clothes rumpled. He stood slowly as I approached, and I noticed he kept his distance, respecting the restraining order, at least. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know I'm not supposed to be here. I know I could get arrested, but I had to come. I had to tell you. God, Mom, I'm so sorry." I stood frozen on my walkway, keys in hand, unsure whether to believe what I was hearing. "Brandon, you're violating the restraining order. You need to leave." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know, I will. But first, please, just let me say this. I've been such an idiot. Such a blind, stupid idiot. Sienna, everything Mr. Morrison told you is true. She manipulated me, isolated me from you, made me believe things that weren't true. But that's not an excuse. I'm a grown man. I should have seen it. I should have protected you instead of attacking you." His voice broke completely. "Mom, I said your life had no meaning. I excluded you from my wedding. I stood by while she called you names and threatened you. I'm so ashamed I can barely look at myself in the mirror. I wanted to run to him, to hold him like I had when he was a child and the world had hurt him. But I stayed where I was, maintaining the physical distance, even as my heart screamed at me to close the gap. Brandon, I'm glad you're seeing things clearly now. I truly am. But words are easy. I'm sorry is easy. You've broken my heart. You've shattered my trust. And I don't know if those things can be repaired." My voice was steady, though inside I was falling apart. "You need to leave now before someone calls the police. If you're really sorry, if you really want to make amends, then you'll respect my boundaries and go through the proper legal channels." Brandon wiped his face with his sleeve, looking every bit the broken man. "I've called off the engagement. Sienna and I are done. Her father's taking her back to Georgia, and I'm gonna find a therapist. I need help, Mom. I need to understand how I let this happen, how I became someone who could treat you that way." He took a step backward toward his car. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know that I love you. I've always loved you. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to become the son you deserved to have." He got in his car and drove away, leaving me standing in my driveway with tears streaming down my face. I called Margaret immediately to report the violation, as I was legally obligated to do, but I also asked her to tell the police that I didn't want Brandon arrested, just warned. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Dorothy, he violated a court order. There should be consequences." I understood her concern,
But something in Brandon's eyes and his voice had been different, genuine. There will be consequences, but jail isn't going to help him become the person he needs to be. Please, Margaret, just this once, can we show some mercy? She agreed, reluctantly, and said she'd handle it. That night, I sat in my garden as the sun set, wrapped in one of Gerald's old sweaters, and I let myself hope, just a little bit. Dr. Vance's office 2 days later felt like a sanctuary. I told her about Richard Morrison's call, about Brandon's appearance at my house, about the tiny flame of hope I was trying not to let consume me. She listened carefully, nodding occasionally, and when she finished, she leaned forward. Dorothy, what do you want? Not what you think you should want, not what would be convenient or easy. What does your heart truly want? I didn't have to think about it. I want my son back, but not the version who valued me so little. I want the real Brandon, the one erased, the one who existed before Sienna. But I don't know if that person still exists, or if I'm just fooling myself. Dr. Vance smiled gently. The person you raised is still in there, Dorothy, but he's been damaged, and damage takes time to heal. The question is whether you're willing to wait, to maintain your boundaries, while giving him space to do the work he needs to do. I thought about that. Could I be patient? Could I hold firm to my boundaries while leaving the door open, not wide open, but slightly ajar for reconciliation? I think so, I said slowly. But I need to see real change. Not just words, not just apologies. Real, sustained change over time, and I need to protect myself in the process. Over the next month, I began to see signs that Brandon was serious about changing. He started therapy with a psychologist who specialized in manipulation and toxic relationships. He didn't contact me directly, respecting the restraining order, but Margaret received a letter from his attorney outlining the steps he was taking. He joined a support group for people recovering from emotionally abusive relationships. He'd started volunteering at a senior center, working with elderly people, and perhaps gaining perspective on how he'd treated me. These weren't grand gestures or quick fixes. They were small, consistent actions that suggested genuine commitment to growth. And slowly, very, very slowly, that flame of hope grew a little brighter. Helen remained skeptical. Actions speak louder than words, but sustained actions speak loudest of all, she said over tea one afternoon. Don't let a few weeks of good behavior erase months of terrible treatment. Make him prove it. Make him prove he really changed before you let him back in. She was right, and I knew it. Forgiveness couldn't be rushed. Trust, once broken so thoroughly, required time and evidence to rebuild. I wouldn't be foolish. I wouldn't be naive. But I also wouldn't close my heart completely. Because despite everything, despite the pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, Brandon was still my son, and that meant something. It had to mean something. 3 months after the courthouse confrontation, I found myself in an unexpected place, a family mediation office in downtown Sacramento. Judge Brannon's order had required Brandon and Sienna to attend mediation about elder respect and financial boundaries, but with Sienna now in Georgia and the engagement dissolved, Brandon had petitioned to complete the requirement alone. Margaret had advised me that I didn't have to participate, that I could let him fulfill the court's mandate without my involvement. But Dr. Vance had suggested that if I wanted any chance at reconciliation, this controlled environment might be the safest place to start rebuilding communication.
The mediator, a woman named Susan Chen, was perhaps 50, with a calm, measured presence that immediately put me at ease. She'd reviewed all the case files, knew the full history, and had spoken separately with both Brandon and me before this joint session. Dorothy, Brandon, she said as we settled into comfortable chairs on opposite sides of her office. We're here today not to assign blame, but to understand how this family reached such a painful breaking point, and to explore whether there's a path forward. Both of you have agreed to speak honestly and listen without interruption. Can you both commit to that? We nodded, though I couldn't bring myself to look directly at Brandon yet. Susan turned to Brandon first. Brandon, you've spent the last 3 months in intensive therapy. What have you learned about yourself and your behavior toward your mother? Brandon's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles white with tension. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. I learned that I was emotionally abused, but that doesn't excuse the fact that I became an abuser myself. Sienna isolated me systematically from Mom, from friends, from anyone who might question her control. She would cry and threaten to leave if I talked to Mom too much. She'd pick apart everything Mom said or did, planting seeds of resentment. But here's the thing. I let her. I chose to believe her narrative instead of trusting my own mother. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I stayed silent, letting him continue. My therapist helped me see patterns I was blind to, how Sienna would create situations where I had to choose between her and Mom, and then reward me when I chose her, how she'd rewrite history, making me doubt my own memories of how kind and generous Mom had always been. But the worst part, the part that makes me sick, is that even under her influence, I knew what I was doing was wrong. Somewhere deep down, I knew. And I did it anyway, because it was easier than standing up to her, easier than risking her anger. His voice cracked, and he finally looked at me. Mom, I betrayed you. I betrayed everything you taught me about loyalty and respect and love, and I can never fully express how sorry I am. Susan let his words hang in the air for a moment before turning to me. Dorothy, how does it feel to hear Brandon say these things? I took a deep breath, trying to organize the chaos of emotions swirling inside me. It feels like a start, I said carefully. But, Susan, Brandon, I need you both to understand something. I've spent 3 months rebuilding my life, learning to be Dorothy Harlan instead of just Brandon's mother. I've made new friends, found new purposes, discovered that my life does have meaning beyond my role as a parent. And I've learned that I deserve respect, not because I'm owed it for being a mother, but because I'm a human being with dignity and worth. I looked at Brandon directly now. Your apology means something, but it doesn't erase the fact that you told the judge my life was meaningless, that you excluded me from your wedding while demanding my property, that you stood by while your fiancé called me a bitter old hag. Brandon flinched at each statement, as if my words were physical blows. You're right, he whispered. You're absolutely right, and I don't know how to make it right. I don't know if I even can. Susan leaned forward slightly. Brandon, Dorothy isn't asking you to make it right immediately. Healing from this kind of breach takes time. Months, possibly years. What she needs to know is whether you're willing to do the work, to prove through consistent action over time that you've truly changed. Words are a beginning, but they're only the beginning. She turned to me. Dorothy, what would you need to see from Brandon to even consider rebuilding a relationship? I'd thought about this question endlessly over the past 3 months, lying awake at night, talking it through with Dr. Vance and Helen. I need to see sustained change, not weeks, not even months, at least a year of consistent, respectful behavior. I need you to continue therapy weekly for at least a year to really understand how you got to this place so it never happens again. I need you to respect my boundaries without complaint, to understand that my time and resources are mine to allocate as I see fit, not yours to demand. And Brandon, I need you to build a life that isn't centered around romantic relationships, because until you can be whole on your own, you'll always be vulnerable to someone like Sienna. Brandon nodded, tears streaming down his face. I can do that. I will do that. Mom, I've already started. I ended my lease on the apartment Sienna and I shared. I'm living in a small place on my own, learning to be alone with myself for the first time in years. It's hard. It's lonely. But my therapist says that's necessary. I need to know who I am without someone defining me. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. And I've also been volunteering at Meadowbrook Senior Living, the facility where Mrs. Patterson from your book club lives. Working with elderly residents, hearing their stories, seeing their dignity and wisdom, it's made me realize how monstrously I treated you. These people deserve respect, and so do you. I'm ashamed it took me so long to see it. The mention of Meadowbrook touched something in me. Mrs. Patterson had been kind to me at book club, never prying, but always supportive. The thought of Brandon volunteering there, actually doing the work to change his perspective, felt significant. How long have you been volunteering? I asked. Brandon met my eyes. 2 months now, 3 times a week. I help with activities, read to residents who have vision problems, just sit and talk with people who are lonely. And Mom, every single day I'm there, I think about you. I think about how easily you could be one of them, how many of them have children who've abandoned them or treat them like burdens. It breaks my heart that I almost became one of those children. Brandon's transformation seems real, but can Dorothy trust it? Keep watching to see if this broken family can truly heal, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Susan guided us through 2 more hours of careful conversation, helping us establish what she called reconciliation benchmarks, specific, measurable goals that would indicate real progress. Brandon would continue therapy weekly for at least a year. He would respect the no-contact order until it expired, communicating only through attorneys. He would document his volunteer work and personal growth. And crucially, he would work on his financial independence, proving he didn't need or want access to my resources. In return, I agreed to remain open to the possibility of reconciliation, to read letters his attorney sent on his behalf, and to consider supervised meetings after 6 months if progress was evident. As we left the mediation office, Brandon and I stood awkwardly in the parking lot, the closest we'd been physically in months, yet still maintaining the legally required distance. Dorothy, Brandon said hesitantly, I know I can't ask you for anything. I know I've lost that right. But would you be willing to accept letters from me? Not asking for anything, not pressuring you, just letting you know how I'm doing, what I'm learning? I considered this carefully. Letters felt safer than phone calls or visits, giving me control over when and how I engaged. Through your attorney, to Margaret. I agreed. Nothing sent directly to me. And Brandon, understand that I might not respond. That doesn't mean I'm not reading them. It just means I need space. The first letter arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by Margaret to my home. I let it sit on my kitchen table for 3 days before I could bring myself to open it. When I finally did, late one evening with a cup of tea and Gerald's sweater wrapped around me, I found 6 handwritten pages. Brandon's handwriting, the same careful script I'd helped him develop in 2nd grade, covered the pages with reflections on his therapy sessions, descriptions of the seniors he'd been working with, and painful admissions about the person he'd become. There were no requests, no manipulation, just raw honesty about his journey. At the end, he'd written, Mom, I'm learning that love isn't about possession or control. It's about respect and freedom. I'm learning to love you the way you deserve. From a distance, with respect for your autonomy, hoping for nothing but your happiness. Even if you never speak to me again, I'm grateful for the 74 years you've spent being an amazing person. I'm sorry I forgot that for a while. I cried as I read those words. Cried in a way I hadn't since Gerald died. These weren't tears of pain exactly. They were tears of release, of cautious hope, of grief for what had been lost, and fragile optimism for what might be rebuilt. I didn't respond to the letter, but I kept it in a box in my closet, alongside other precious things. Over the following months, more letters came, one every 2 weeks, like clockwork. Each one documented Brandon's progress, his setbacks, his growing understanding of himself. He wrote about discovering that Sienna had been monitoring his phone, reading his texts to me and deleting ones that were too warm. He wrote about realizing he'd been depressed for years, masked by the chaos of the toxic relationship. He wrote about making amends to friends he'd pushed away, rebuilding connections Sienna had severed. Helen read some of the letters with me, her skeptical eye looking for signs of manipulation. "I hate to say it," she admitted after reading the 5th one, "but these seem genuine. The boy's doing the work, Dorothy. Real work, not just for show." Even Margaret, who'd been protective and suspicious throughout, acknowledged that Brandon's consistent actions over months suggested real change. "Dorothy, I'm not saying you should forgive and forget," she said during one of our regular check-ins, "but I am saying that if reconciliation is what you want, he's building a foundation for it. The question is whether you can trust it, whether you can risk being hurt again." Dr. Vance helped me work through that question over many sessions. "Dorothy, trust isn't an all-or-nothing proposition. You can trust Brandon in small ways, with small things, and see how he handles that responsibility before trusting him with bigger things. Think of it like physical therapy after a severe injury. You don't run a marathon immediately. You start with small steps, building strength gradually." That metaphor resonated with me. I could start small. I could test the waters without diving in completely. So, after 6 months of letters, I did something that felt both terrifying and necessary. I wrote back. My letter was brief, just 1 page compared to his 6, but it was honest. "Brandon, I've read every letter. I see the work you're doing, and I'm proud of you for facing hard truths about yourself. That takes courage. I'm not ready for contact beyond these letters, but I want you to know that I'm healing too. I'm building a life that has meaning beyond being your mother, and that's healthy for both of us. Keep doing the work. Keep growing. And maybe, someday, we'll find our way back to each other. Love, Mom." I sealed it, gave it to Margaret to pass along, and then spent the evening in my garden feeling lighter than I had in months. Brandon's response came faster than usual, just 4 days later. His joy was palpable, even through the written word. "Mom, you called yourself Mom again. You signed it Love. Those small things mean everything to me. I know I don't deserve your love, that I have to earn it back through years of proof, but knowing you haven't completely closed the door, that you're willing to let me try, it's given me hope I didn't know I could still feel. I won't let you down. Not ever again." The letter went on to describe a breakthrough in therapy where he had finally processed the anger he'd been carrying toward Gerald for dying, leaving him without a father figure to guide him. "I think I blamed you somehow for being the one who survived. How twisted is that? But understanding it helps me see how Sienna was able to exploit that unresolved anger." As winter turned to spring, the letters continued, and gradually something shifted in me. The raw wound of betrayal began to scar over, still visible, still tender, but no longer bleeding. I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, my son was finding his way back to himself, and as he did, I was finding my way to a new version of myself, stronger, more independent, less defined by my relationships to others. Gerald would have been proud, I thought. He'd always encouraged my independence, even when it wasn't common for men of his generation to do so. He'd seen me as a whole person, not just his wife or Brandon's mother. And now, finally, I was learning to see myself that way too. The 1-year anniversary of Judge Brennan's restraining order arrived on a crisp October morning. I woke early, made myself breakfast, and sat in my garden watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Today, legally, Brandon could contact me directly if I permitted it, The protective order would expire at midnight, and the question that had haunted me for months would finally need an answer. Was I ready to see my son face to face? Dr. Vance had prepared me for this decision point, helping me understand that I could set whatever pace felt comfortable, that expired legal orders didn't mean I had to rush into anything. Margaret called at 9 o'clock. "Dorothy, Brandon's attorney contacted me. Brandon wants to know if you'd be willing to meet with him in a public place, with me present if you'd like. He's not pressuring you, but he wanted to extend the invitation now that he's legally able to." My heart hammered in my chest. A year of letters had shown me consistent change, genuine growth. Brandon had completed his court-ordered mediation requirements, continued therapy religiously, and by all accounts had become someone quite different from the man who'd stood in that courtroom calling my life meaningless. But reading letters was one thing. Sitting across from him, looking into his eyes, would be another entirely. "Tell him yes," I heard myself say, surprising even myself. "But I want to meet at the botanical gardens, in the public cafe area, and Margaret, I do want you there, at least for the first meeting." I could almost hear Margaret's smile through the phone. "I think that's wise, Dorothy. Cautious, but open. Exactly the right approach. I'll set it up for this weekend if that works for you." I agreed, and after we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at nothing. This was really happening. After a year of separation, of healing, of gradual rebuilding through written words, I was going to see my son again. The thought filled me with equal parts hope and terror. Saturday arrived too quickly. I changed clothes 3 times before settling on a simple blue dress that Gerald had always said brought out my eyes. Helen came over to help me get ready, fussing with my hair like I was going to prom instead of meaning my estranged son. "You look beautiful," she said, squeezing my shoulders. "And strong. Don't forget that. You're not the same woman who got that first phone call a year ago. You're stronger now." She was right. I'd spent a year building a life that didn't revolve around Brandon, joining committees, traveling with friends from book club, even taking a watercolor class at the community center. I discovered that Dorothy Harlan was more than someone's mother, someone's wife. I was a whole person with interests and value all my own.
Margaret met me at the Botanical Gardens entrance, her presence reassuring and professional as always. "He's already here," she said gently. "He's been here for an hour, actually, sitting at the cafe, waiting." Something about that image, Brandon arriving early, nervous, eager, tugged at my heart. We walked together through the gardens, past blooming roses and towering oaks, until we reached the outdoor cafe. And there he was, my son. He looked different than I remembered. Thinner, but healthier somehow. His hair was graying at the temples. When had that happened? He wore a simple polo shirt and jeans, and his hands were wrapped around a coffee cup like it was an anchor, keeping him grounded. When he saw me, he stood immediately, and I saw his eyes fill with tears. He didn't move toward me, respecting my space, waiting for me to set the tone. I walked slowly to the table, Margaret at my side, and sat down across from him. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, mother and son, strangers and intimates all at once. "Hi, Mom," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Hi, Brandon," I replied, and hearing his name on my lips again, spoken directly to him rather than written in a letter, felt monumental, like crossing a bridge I'd thought might be burned forever. "Thank you for meeting me," Brandon said, his hands still wrapped around that coffee cup. "I know you didn't have to. I know I don't deserve it." I held up a hand, stopping him. "Brandon, we've covered that ground in letters. I know you're sorry. I know you've done the work. Today isn't about apologies. Today is about seeing if we can be in the same space together, if we can have a normal conversation." He nodded eagerly. "Yes, absolutely.
What do you want to talk about? I thought for a moment, then smiled slightly. Tell me about the seniors at Meadowbrook. Your letters mention them, but I want to hear it in your own words. See your face when you talk about them. Brandon's entire demeanor changed, softening with genuine affection. Mom, they're incredible. There's this woman, Grace. She's 92 and sharper than most people half her age. She was a chemist back when women weren't welcome in science, and she's got stories that would blow your mind. And Mr. Patterson, you know him through his wife from book club. He's teaching me to play chess. I lose every single time, but he's so patient. He paused, looking down at his hands. Working with them, hearing their stories, seeing how many of them are lonely because their families don't visit. Mom, it's been humbling. I see you in them. I see the mother I almost lost, the relationship I almost destroyed, reflected in their sadness about their own kids who don't call or visit. Is that why you keep doing it? Out of guilt? Brandon shook his head firmly. It started that way, maybe, but now I do it because I genuinely care about them. Because they've taught me things my therapist never could. About resilience, about forgiveness, about how to maintain dignity when the world treats you as invisible. Grace told me, once, that getting old is like becoming a ghost. People look through you, talk over you, dismiss your opinions because they think age has made you irrelevant. She said the cruelest thing her son ever did wasn't putting her in assisted living. It was stopping seeing her as a full person with thoughts and feelings and value. His voice cracked. I did that to you, Mom. I made you a ghost. The emotion in this reunion is overwhelming. If you're feeling it too, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who understands the complicated nature of family relationships. Margaret had been quiet, but now she spoke. Brandon, Dorothy mentioned in our last conversation that she needs to understand what safeguards you've put in place to prevent this from happening again. Can you speak to that? Brandon nodded, seeming grateful for the direct question. I'm still in therapy, and I plan to continue indefinitely. Dr. Richards has helped me identify the patterns I need to watch for. Isolation tactics, someone who seems too good to be true, anyone who tries to come between me and my friends or family. I've also joined a men's support group for survivors of emotional abuse. Hearing other men's stories, sharing mine, it's helped me understand this wasn't a one-time mistake. I was vulnerable and I need to address why. He took a deep breath and continued. I've also been working on my relationship with myself. That sounds like therapy speak, I know, but it's true. I spent so many years defining myself through romantic relationships. First through Dad's death and trying to be the man of the house, then through various girlfriends, then Sienna. I never learned to just be Brandon, alone, complete, on my own. So I've stayed single. I'll probably stay single for a long while, because until I can be whole without someone else, I'm not safe to be in a relationship. And I'm definitely not safe to be trusted with access to your life again. His honesty was striking, painful in its clarity. I found myself believing him, not just because of the words, but because of the year of consistent action behind them. Still, questions remained. What about money, Brandon? I asked, deciding to be direct. Your letters never mention your finances, but that was at the heart of so much of this. You and Sienna felt entitled to my villa, to my money. How do I know this isn't an elaborate plan to eventually get access to my assets? I watched his face carefully, looking for any flicker of deception. Instead, I saw something that looked like relief at the directness of the question. I wondered when you'd ask that, Brandon said, pulling out his phone. Mom, Margaret, I want to show you something. I've been working with a financial counselor for the past 6 months. He opened a spreadsheet and turned the phone toward us.
This is my budget, my savings plan, everything. I took a hard look at my lifestyle and realized I'd been living beyond my means, always assuming that eventually, when you passed, God, it sounds so mercenary saying it out loud, I'd inherit enough to cover my poor choices. So I downsized. I sold the luxury car and bought a used Toyota. I moved to a smaller apartment. I cut up my credit cards and paid off my debt. Margaret leaned forward, studying the spreadsheet with her attorney's eye. Brandon, this shows you've paid off $47,000 in debt in less than a year. How? Brandon's cheeks flushed slightly. I took a second job on weekends, doing landscaping, physical work, nothing glamorous. Between that and my regular salary as an accountant and living extremely frugally, I managed it. I wanted to prove it to myself and, eventually, to you, Mom, that I don't need your money, that I can build a stable life on my own. So I'm telling you now, change your will if you haven't already. Leave everything to charity. I don't want it. I don't need it. I just want you. His words hit me like a physical force. I'd expected many things from this meeting, but not this level of brutal honesty about finances, not a spreadsheet documenting his debt repayment, not a genuine rejection of inheritance. Margaret caught my eye, and I could see she was impressed despite herself. Brandon, I said slowly, I appreciate your honesty, but you understand that I can't just take your word for it. Trust has to be rebuilt slowly, with consistent proof over time. He nodded vigorously. I know. That's why I brought the spreadsheet, why I'm willing to be completely transparent about my finances. I'll prove it, Mom, however long it takes. We talked for another 2 hours, covering everything from the mundane, his work projects, my watercolor class, to the profound. Brandon told me about his therapy breakthroughs, about understanding that his fear of abandonment after Gerald's death had made him vulnerable to someone like Sienna who promised to never leave him, while simultaneously pushing away the one person who'd never abandoned him, me. I told him about my journey of self-discovery, about learning to set boundaries, not just with him, but in all my relationships, about finding purpose beyond being a caregiver and mother. It wasn't entirely comfortable, this conversation. There were awkward pauses, moments of pain, flickers of old hurt, but there was also something new. Honesty. Raw, uncomfortable, necessary honesty. As the afternoon sun slanted through the trees, Margaret checked her watch. Dorothy, Brandon, we've been here for 3 hours. I think this has been productive, but it might be wise to end on a positive note rather than pushing too far. She was right. I was emotionally exhausted, drained in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant, but was definitely overwhelming. Brandon stood, and this time he held out his hand, not for a hug, not for anything presumptuous, just a handshake. A formal acknowledgement of this new beginning. I looked at his hand for a moment, then made a decision. I stood and pulled him into a brief hug. He stiffened in surprise, then carefully wrapped his arms around me, and I felt him shaking with silent sobs.
We'll take this slow, I said softly as we separated. I'm willing to meet again, maybe in a few weeks. But Brandon, understand, I'm not the same mother you had before. I've changed. My boundaries are firmer, my expectations are higher, and I won't tolerate disrespect or manipulation ever again. Can you accept that? He wiped his eyes and nodded. I don't want the old version back, Mom. That relationship was broken in ways I didn't see. I want to build something new with you, something healthier, based on mutual respect, not obligation or guilt or expectation of inheritance. Just love. Real love. The way it should be. As Margaret and I walked back through the botanical gardens toward the parking lot, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. A sense of possibility. Not certainty,
not blind trust, but genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind us. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked, and I had to think about it for a moment. "Like I've been holding my breath for a year and can finally exhale," I said, "but also scared. Scared to hope too much, scared to trust too quickly, scared of being hurt again." Margaret squeezed my arm. "That's wisdom, Dorothy. Fear isn't always bad. Sometimes it's just your intuition telling you to proceed carefully. And that's exactly what you're doing." That night, I called Helen and told her about the meeting. She listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and finally said, "Well, I'll be damned. The boy might actually have gotten his head screwed on straight." Coming from Helen, that was high praise. "But, Dorothy," she continued, her voice serious, "promise me you'll keep those boundaries firm. One good meeting doesn't erase a year of hell. Make him prove it's real. Make him earn his way back into your life, inch by inch." I promised, and I meant it, because as much as I wanted my son back, as much as that hug had rekindled maternal love I'd tried to protect myself from feeling, I knew Helen was right. Forgiveness was possible, but it had to be earned. And Brandon would have to keep earning it, probably for the rest of our lives. The weeks following our first meeting settled into a cautious rhythm. Brandon and I met every 2 weeks, always in public places, sometimes with Margaret present, sometimes without. We took walks in parks, had coffee at cafes, once even attended a community orchestra concert together. Each meeting was carefully calibrated, long enough to connect, short enough to prevent overwhelm. I watched him carefully during these encounters, looking for signs of the old Brandon, the one who'd been so easily manipulated. But what I saw instead was someone fundamentally changed, someone who'd looked into his darkness and chosen to claw his way toward light. It was during our 5th meeting at a small diner near my house that Brandon brought something unexpected. He slid an envelope across the table, his expression serious. "Mom, I need to show you something. It's not easy to look at, and I debated whether to share it at all. But my therapist thinks you deserve to know the full extent of what was happening so you can make informed decisions about our relationship going forward." My stomach tightened with anxiety as I opened the envelope. Inside were printed text messages, dozens of them, between Sienna and someone named Chloe. As I began reading, my blood ran cold. The messages were from 2 years ago, months before Brandon had even proposed to Sienna. "He's perfect," she had written to this Chloe person. "His mother is loaded, like seriously wealthy, multi-million-dollar properties, investment portfolios, the works. And he's an only child, so it all comes to him eventually." Chloe had responded, "But doesn't he have to wait for her to die? That could be decades. Old people are living forever now, LOL." Sienna's reply made my hands shake. That's the beauty of it. She's isolated, no close friends, totally dependent on Brandon emotionally. Once we're married, I can push her out completely. Maybe she has an accident, or we get her declared incompetent. Either way, we get control of the assets. I couldn't breathe. The casual way they discussed my death, my incapacitation, as if I were an obstacle rather than a human being, it was beyond manipulation. This was calculation, possibly even conspiracy to commit elder abuse or worse. I looked up at Brandon, who was watching me with an expression of deep shame and sorrow. "Where did you get these?" I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper. Brandon's jaw clenched. After Sienna and I broke up, after her father took her back to Georgia, I finally looked at her laptop, the one she had left at our apartment. I found these messages in a backup file. "She'd been planning this from the beginning, Mom. I was never anything but a means to an end. And you were just an obstacle to be removed." Margaret, who was with us that day, took the papers from my trembling hands and read through them with her attorney's eye. Her face grew progressively darker. "Dorothy, Brandon
These messages constitute evidence of conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, possibly even conspiracy to commit murder, given the accident reference. Have you shown these to the police? Brandon nodded. I filed a report last month. The detective said they're investigating, but since nothing actually happened, it's hard to know what charges they can bring. Conspiracy is difficult to prove without concrete action, but they've opened a file, and they contacted Mr. Morrison to warn him. He looked at me with anguished eyes. Mom, I brought the woman who wanted to kill you into our lives. I almost helped her isolate you to the point where she could have actually done it. How do I live with that? The revelation was staggering, yet in a twisted way, it explained so much. Sienna's coldness toward me from the beginning, her systematic efforts to exclude me from Brandon's life, the audacity of demanding my villa, it had all been part of a calculated plan. Not just manipulation born of entitlement, but actual predatory behavior with my assets and possibly my life as the target. I felt violated in a way I hadn't even felt during the worst of our conflict. I heard myself say to Brandon, though my voice sounded distant, strange. Sociopaths, and that's clearly what she is, are skilled at deception. That's how they operate. Dr. Vance had an emergency session available that afternoon, and I took it. I sat in her familiar office, the envelope of messages on the coffee table between us, like a poisonous thing neither of us wanted to touch. Dorothy, how are you processing this? She asked gently. I laughed, a harsh sound without humor. I don't know if I'm processing it. Part of me feels vindicated. I knew something was deeply wrong with Sienna from the beginning. But another part feels, I don't know, dirty. Like I was nearly the victim of something too horrible to contemplate, and I didn't even see it coming. Dr. Vance nodded slowly. What you're feeling is a trauma response. You've been confronted with evidence that someone planned to harm you, possibly fatally. That's not something you just shake off. Over the next few days, the reality of what those messages meant settled into my bones like ice. Sienna hadn't just been a difficult daughter-in-law or a manipulative partner to Brandon. She'd been a predator who identified a vulnerable target, a wealthy widow with a devoted son, and methodically worked to exploit that vulnerability. The wedding exclusion, the villa demand, all of it had been designed to demonstrate to me and to Brandon how little my wishes mattered, softening us both up for whatever came next. If I'd been weaker, less willing to establish boundaries, where would I have been? Isolated, possibly declared incompetent, stripped of my assets and autonomy, or worse?
The truth about Sienna is more sinister than anyone imagined. Stay tuned to find out how this shocking revelation changes everything for Dorothy and Brandon. Helen was apoplectic when I showed her the messages. That evil, calculating witch, she raged, pacing my living room. Dorothy, you need better security. You need, I don't know, a bodyguard or something. What if she comes back? What if she's still planning something? Her fear was contagious, and I felt my own anxiety spike. Margaret had assured me that the restraining order was still in effect, that Sienna was required to stay away from California, that Mr. Morrison was keeping her under close supervision in Georgia. But restraining orders were just paper. They couldn't stop someone truly determined to do harm. For the first time since installing the security system a year ago, I felt genuinely afraid in my own home. Brandon called that evening, his voice thick with worry. Mom, I can't stop thinking about those messages. I can't stop imagining what might have happened if you hadn't stood up for yourself, if you'd let us use the villa, if you'd been more accommodating like she kept demanding. She would have seen that as weakness, as an opportunity to push further. His voice broke. I keep having nightmares about finding you. He couldn't finish the sentence, but I didn't need to. I understood. Brandon, I said firmly, pushing my own fear down to comfort my son. But that didn't happen. I did stand up for myself. I did set boundaries. And yes, part of that was your father's influence. He always taught me to know my worth. But I made those choices. I protected myself. And ultimately,
that protected you, too. The police investigation moved slowly, as these things do. Detective Sarah Moss, the officer assigned to the case, called me in for an interview. She was perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that I found reassuring. "Mrs. Harlan, I want to be honest with you about what we can and can't do with this evidence," she said, the printed messages spread on the table between us. "These texts show clear intent to commit financial elder abuse and possibly harm you physically. But intent alone, without action, is difficult to prosecute. What we can do is build a file, monitor Sienna Morrison's activities, and make sure we know we're watching. That alone often deters further action." "But she could still come after my mother," Brandon interjected. He'd insisted on being present for the interview, protective in a way that was touching, but also reminded me of how much he'd failed to protect me when it mattered. Detective Moss nodded. "She could, but Mr. Morrison has been cooperative. He's provided evidence that his daughter is in intensive psychiatric care in Georgia. He's also agreed to notify us immediately if there's any indication she's planning to travel. And Mrs. Harlan's security measures are excellent. Cameras, alarms, the works. If Miss Morrison comes near you, we'll know immediately." It was meant to be reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, targeted, even from across the country. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out Gerald's old revolver from the safe in our bedroom closet. He'd taught me to shoot decades ago, insisting that a woman living alone after his death would need to know how to protect herself. I'd thought it paranoid at the time, but now I was grateful. The gun felt heavy and cold in my hands, foreign yet familiar. I didn't plan to carry it around or sleep with it under my pillow like some kind of action movie character, but knowing it was there, knowing I had a last line of defense if everything else failed, provided a small measure of comfort. I also scheduled a refresher course at the local shooting range. Better to be prepared and never need it than to need it and not be prepared. Brandon's guilt over bringing Sienna into our lives intensified after the messages came to light. During our next meeting, he could barely look at me. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Can you ever really trust me again? Because I don't know if I'd be able to in your position. I brought a predator into your life. I defended her. I chose her over you. How do you move past that?" His pain was genuine, but I'd learned in therapy that I couldn't take responsibility for managing his emotions. That was his work to do with his own therapist. "Brandon," I said carefully, "trust isn't all or nothing. I trust that you're genuinely sorry. I trust that you're doing the work to change. But do I trust you completely, without reservation, the way I did before? No, and I may never again. That's a consequence of your choices, one you'll have to learn to live with." He absorbed this like a physical blow, nodding slowly. "That's fair. More than fair, actually." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been thinking about selling Dad's car collection, the one he left me in his will. It's worth about $200,000, and I want to put that money in a trust fund specifically for your care as you get older. Home health aides, medical expenses, whatever you need. Not as an inheritance or a gift you have to thank me for, as restitution for what I almost let happen to you." I started to protest, but he held up his hand. "Please, Mom, I need to do this. Not for you to forgive me or to buy my way back into your good graces. For me, so I can look at myself in the mirror and know I did something tangible to protect you the way I should have all along." The offer touched me, but I was also wary. Was this genuine restitution or another form of control disguised as generosity? Dr. Vance helped me think it through. "Dorothy, you can accept his offer without it changing the dynamic of your relationship. You can let him set up the trust while maintaining your boundaries. His need to make amends doesn't obligate you to anything." So I agreed, but with conditions. The trust would be managed by Margaret, not Brandon. I would have complete control over when and how the funds were used. And most importantly, Brandon's contribution to my care didn't buy him unlimited access to my life or decisions. He agreed to everything, without hesitation, and within a month, the cars were sold and the trust established. Mr. Morrison called me directly for the first time since that initial conversation a year ago.
Mrs. Harlan, I wanted to update you personally about Sienna. She's been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. The psychiatrists believe she's been this way for years, perhaps her whole life, but we, her mother and I, we didn't see it. We thought her manipulative behavior was just teenage drama, then young adult selfishness. We didn't realize we were raising someone fundamentally incapable of empathy. He said, his voice heavy with a parent's grief. She'll be in a long-term treatment facility for the foreseeable future. Not prison, but not free either. I want you to know that I've also established a fund, completely separate from Sienna, she has no access to it, to cover any security or therapeutic costs you've incurred because of my daughter's actions. I was struck by the parallel. Two parents trying to atone for their children's sins, trying to protect someone who'd been hurt by someone they loved. Mr. Morrison, I said gently, you're not responsible for your adult daughter's choices, any more than I'm responsible for my adult son. But I appreciate the gesture, and I appreciate you keeping me informed. He sighed deeply. Mrs. Harlan, Dorothy, if I may, one parent to another, how do you survive this? How do you live with knowing your child is capable of such darkness? It was a question I'd asked myself about Brandon in those dark days when he'd been so cruel. I remembered they're more than their worst moments, and you hold on to hope that they can become better than they are right now. It's all we can do. After that conversation, I found myself thinking about Sienna differently, not with sympathy, her actions were inexcusable, but with a kind of sad understanding. She was sick, fundamentally broken in ways that had nothing to do with me. I'd simply been a convenient target, a means to an end. There was no personal animosity in her plans to harm me, just cold calculation. In a strange way, that made it less personal and somehow more terrifying. I was reminded of what Dr. Vance had once said. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. True sociopaths don't hate their victims. They just don't see them as fully human. Sienna looked at me and saw only an obstacle, a resource, never a person. That was the real horror. 6 months after the revelation of Sienna's messages, something remarkable happened. I realized I'd gone an entire week without thinking about Sienna. Not about the threats, not about the messages, not about what might have been. The fear that had gripped me so tightly was finally loosening its hold. I mentioned this to Dr. Vance during our now monthly sessions, and she smiled with genuine pleasure. Dorothy, that's significant progress. You're not letting trauma define your present. That takes tremendous strength. I'd begun to see it too. I was no longer just surviving. I was living again, fully, and with purpose.
Brandon and I had fallen into a new normal. We met weekly now, sometimes for lunch, sometimes for walks, occasionally for dinner at my house, though those dinners still felt weighted with significance, inviting him into my home being a level of trust I was only beginning to rebuild. He'd kept every promise he'd made. He remained in therapy, continued his volunteer work at Meadowbrook, maintained his financial independence, and most importantly, respected my boundaries without complaint. When I said I needed space, he gave it. When I said I wasn't ready for something, he accepted it. The change was profound, and I was beginning to believe permanent. It was during one of our weekly lunches that Brandon brought up something I hadn't expected. Mom, I've been thinking about Thanksgiving. I know it's still a month away, but I wanted to ask, and I'll completely understand if the answer is no. Would you be willing to spend it together? Nothing fancy, just the two of us. I could cook, or we could order from that Italian place you like, or we could each make something, whatever you're comfortable with. His nervousness was palpable, and I realized how much he'd come to fear rejection from me. Not in a manipulative way, but in the way someone who's genuinely hurt another person fears they've lost them forever. I thought about it carefully. Thanksgiving had been Gerald's favorite holiday. He loved having Brandon home from college, loved the tradition of the three of us cooking together, making far too much food and eating leftovers for days. The past 6 years without Gerald, I'd spent Thanksgiving with Helen or alone, unable to face the memories. But maybe it was time to create new memories, different but meaningful. Yes, I heard myself say, but at my house. And Brandon, no expectations. If it feels wrong or too painful, I need to know I can end it early without guilt. He nodded eagerly, relief flooding his face. Of course, Mom, whatever you need. Always. As Thanksgiving approached, I found myself surprisingly nervous. This would be the first major holiday we'd spent together since before the wedding debacle. Helen, ever the protective friend, offered to be on standby. I'll keep my phone on loud, she said. If you need an emergency exit excuse, I'll call with a fake crisis. I appreciated her concern, but declined. If Brandon and I were going to rebuild our relationship, I needed to trust that we could navigate even potentially difficult situations. Still, I took precautions. I told Margaret about the plan. I made sure my security system was armed. I even mentioned it to Detective Moss, who assured me that Sienna was still in Georgia, under supervision, with no indication of travel plans. Thanksgiving morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of November day that makes you grateful for warm houses and warmer relationships. Brandon arrived at 10, his arms full of grocery bags and an unnervous smile on his face. I thought we could cook together, like we used to with Dad, he said hesitantly. But if you'd rather I just help or stay out of the way, that's fine too. I felt emotion well up in my chest. This was the Brandon I remembered, the thoughtful son who paid attention to what mattered. Let's cook together, I agreed, and we moved into the kitchen, falling into an old rhythm I'd thought was lost forever. As we worked, him chopping vegetables while I prepared the turkey, both of us occasionally reaching for the same spice and laughing, I felt something shift. The ghost of Gerald seemed present in the best way, not as painful absence, but as gentle memory. Dad would have put way too much sage in the stuffing, he said at one point, and I laughed because it was true. Gerald had been enthusiastic, but not always skilled in the kitchen. He'd also have eaten half the sweet potatoes before they made it to the table, I added, and we both smiled at the memory. It felt healing, talking about Gerald with Brandon, sharing the loss we'd both carried in isolation for so long. Over dinner, as we sat at the table that had once seated 3, but now seated 2, Brandon cleared his throat. Mom, I have something for you. I wasn't sure if I should give it to you or if it's too presumptuous, but he pulled out a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. My first instinct was wariness. Gifts could be manipulation, obligations in disguise. But his expression was so open, so vulnerable that I took the package. Inside was a simple silver frame, and in it, a photograph I'd never seen before. It was Gerald and I, young and laughing, with baby Brandon between us. We were in the backyard of our first house, the one we'd sold when Brandon was 5. Where did you get this? I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Brandon smiled softly. I found it in a box of Dad's things I've been going through. There were dozens of pictures, journals, letters. Dad documented everything, did you know that? And Mom, he wrote about you constantly, about how much he loved you, how proud he was of the mother you were, how he worried about leaving you alone. I've been reading his words, and it's like getting to know him again as an adult, instead of just remembering him through a kid's eyes. He loved you completely, Mom. And reading his words, I understand now. What I almost threw away, the kind of love you're capable of, the kind of loyalty and devotion you showed him and me, that's rare. That's precious. And I treated it like it was worthless. I couldn't speak. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I clutched the photograph, looking at the young family we'd been, unaware of the challenges ahead. Thank you, I finally whispered. This means more than you know. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, eating turkey and sharing memories of Gerald, and I realized something profound. I was happy. Not just content, not just okay, but genuinely happy to be sharing this moment with my son. The wound between us wasn't fully healed. Perhaps it never would be, but it was healing, and that was enough. After dinner, as we cleaned up together, Brandon's phone rang. He glanced at it, and his face went pale. It's Detective Moss, he said, and my stomach dropped. We'd both been living with the low-level anxiety that Sienna might make another move, that the other shoe might drop. He put it on speaker. Mr. Harlan, Mrs. Harlan, I wanted to inform you of a development. Sienna Morrison escaped from her treatment facility in Georgia 3 days ago.
Authorities have been searching for her, but she hasn't been located. We have no indication she's heading to California, but I wanted you to be aware and vigilant." The detective's words were meant to be reassuring, but they had the opposite effect. If Sienna had escaped 3 days ago and hadn't been found yet, she was smart enough to avoid detection, and smart enough to be dangerous. After Detective Moss hung up, Brandon and I stood in my kitchen, the remains of our lovely Thanksgiving dinner suddenly seeming like relics from another lifetime. "Mom, I'm not leaving you alone," Brandon said firmly. "I'm staying here tonight, on the couch, and every night until they find her. I don't care if it takes weeks. I failed to protect you before. I won't fail again." Part of me wanted to argue, to maintain my independence, to prove I didn't need protecting, but the larger part, the part that was genuinely afraid, accepted his offer gratefully. "Okay," I agreed. "But Brandon, if she comes here, if she tries anything, you get out, you call the police, and you get out. I won't have you hurt because of me."
That night, I lay in bed with my phone on the nightstand, Gerald's gun in the drawer beside me, and my son sleeping on the couch downstairs. The security system beeped reassuringly every few minutes as it scanned the perimeter. Every sound seemed amplified, the wind rustling leaves, a car passing on the street, the house settling. I barely slept, dozing fitfully and jerking awake at every noise. At 3 a.m, I gave up and went downstairs. Brandon was awake too, sitting on the couch with his own phone in hand, clearly monitoring something. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, and I shook my head. We sat together in the darkened living room, two people bonded by love and now by fear, waiting for dawn. The next day brought no news. Detective Moss called to say there had been no sightings, no credit card usage, no digital footprint at all. It was as if Sienna had vanished into thin air. Brandon took emergency leave from work, refusing to go to his office and leave me alone. Helen came over with groceries, her face set in grim determination. "That girl shows up here, she'll have to go through me," she declared, and I almost smiled at the image of my 76-year-old friend taking on a dangerous woman half her age. But Helen was fierce, and I was grateful for her presence, her refusal to let me face this alone. Margaret arrived that afternoon with news. "Dorothy, I've been in contact with Mr. Morrison. He's devastated about Sienna's escape. He wants you to know he's hired a private security firm to track her down, in addition to what the police are doing. He's also offered to pay for round-the-clock security for you until she's found." It was a generous offer, but I was hesitant. Security guards? Isn't that extreme? Margaret's expression was serious. "Dorothy, this woman wrote about causing you to have an accident. She's unstable, dangerous, and currently unaccounted for. Extreme is warranted." I looked at Brandon, who nodded emphatically. "Please, Mom, let Mr. Morrison do this. Let us keep you safe." By the 3rd day of Sienna being missing, I'd agreed to the security detail. 2 professionals, a man named Marcus and a woman named Jane, took shifts outside my house in an unmarked car. Their presence was both comforting and disturbing, a constant reminder of the threat I faced. I tried to maintain normalcy, going about my daily routines, but fear colored everything. I jumped at shadows, checked and rechecked locks, barely ate. Brandon watched me with growing concern. "Mom, you can't live like this. The stress is eating you alive." He was right, but what choice did I have? Somewhere out there was a woman who'd planned my death, who'd been thwarted but might try again. How does someone just go about their day under those circumstances? On the 4th day, Detective Moss called with an update that changed everything. "Mrs. Harlan, we've located Sienna Morrison. She's been arrested in Arizona at the Mexican border. She was attempting to leave the country with a fake passport. She's now in federal custody for escape, fraud, and we're working on additional charges related to the threats against you." The relief was so overwhelming I actually felt dizzy. "She's caught? She can't get to me?" My voice sounded desperate, childlike. "She's caught," Detective Moss confirmed. "And this time, with the escape and the fake passport, she's looking at serious federal prison time. She won't be a threat to you again, Mrs. Harlan. I can promise you that." After the call ended, I sat down heavily, my legs unable to support me. Brandon wrapped his arms around me, and I let myself cry,
Deep, racking sobs of relief and release. The fear I'd been holding at bay for 4 days poured out of me in waves. "It's over," Brandon kept saying. "It's really over. She can't hurt you. I won't let anyone hurt you ever again." His words were both comfort and oath, and I believed him. Not because he was suddenly capable of protecting me from all harm, but because I saw in his eyes that he finally understood what it meant to truly care about someone else's well-being more than his own comfort or desires. My son had grown up, finally and completely, through pain and consequence and determined change. 3 months after Sienna's arrest, spring arrived in Sacramento with an explosion of color. My garden, which I'd tended with such care during the darkest days, was now a riot of tulips and daffodils, the roses preparing to bloom. I stood among the flowers one Saturday morning, pruning shears in hand, feeling something I hadn't felt in nearly 2 years. Peace. Not the fragile, anxious peace of someone waiting for the next disaster, but genuine, deep-rooted peace. The kind that comes from having survived something terrible and discovered you're stronger than you knew. Detective Moss had called the previous week with final news. Sienna had pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges and received a 15-year sentence. She wouldn't be eligible for parole for at least 10 years. The threat was truly over. Brandon had become a regular presence in my life again, but different than before. He didn't call every day or expect constant contact. He respected my independence, my friendships, my separate life. When we got together, it was because we both wanted to, not out of obligation or guilt. He'd continued his work at Meadowbrook, and just last week, Grace, the 92-year-old chemist he told me about, had asked to meet me. "Your son talks about you constantly," she said when we met for tea at the senior living facility. "He's so proud of you, of how strong you are. And if I may say so, you've raised a good man. He made mistakes, but he's owned them. That's rare these days." Her words had meant more than she could know, because the question that had haunted me through everything, had I failed as a mother, was finally answered. I hadn't failed. I raised a son capable of recognizing his mistakes, of doing the hard work to change, of understanding that love without respect is worthless. Yes, he'd lost his way for a while, fallen under the influence of someone truly dangerous, but the foundation I'd built in him, the values Gerald and I had instilled, had been strong enough that he'd found his way back. That was success, even if it didn't look like the smooth, uncomplicated relationship I'd once imagined we'd have. The villa in Carmel had sat empty during the entire ordeal, a symbol of what had nearly torn us apart. But last month, I'd made a decision. I called Brandon and asked if he'd like to drive to Carmel with me for the weekend. Not to discuss anything heavy, but just to finally enjoy the place her father and I had dreamed of. He'd agreed immediately, and we'd made the drive together, talking about everything and nothing. When we arrived and I unlocked the door, it felt like opening a door to the future rather than being haunted by the past. We'd spent the weekend walking on the beach, cooking simple meals, and just being together in a place that had been a battleground but was now reclaimed. On our last evening there, as we sat on the deck watching the sunset over the Pacific, Brandon said something that surprised me. "Mom, I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately, about the kind of man he was, the kind of father, and I realized that he made mistakes too. He wasn't perfect, but he was present, he was accountable, and he loved completely. I want to be that kind of man, not perfect, but present, not without flaws, but willing to own them and do better." He turned to look at me, the ocean breeze ruffling his graying hair. "I want to make you and Dad proud, not through grand gestures or expensive gifts, but through showing up, day after day, being someone you can count on."
"You already are," I told him, and I meant it. The Brandon sitting beside me wasn't the broken man who'd stood in court calling my life meaningless. He wasn't even the manipulated person who'd excluded me from his wedding. He was someone new, forged through fire and failure, someone who'd looked at his worst self and chosen to become better. "Dad would be proud of you," I continued. "Not because you never fell, but because you got back up. That's what courage is, Brandon.
Not avoiding mistakes, but facing them head on and doing the work to change. We sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and I felt Gerald's presence like a blessing, like approval from beyond. When we returned to Sacramento, Helen greeted me with her usual blunt affection. "Well, you look different," she observed, studying my face. "Whiter somehow. Did something happen in Carmel?" I smiled, thinking about the weekend, about the healing that had occurred in that beautiful place that had nearly been stolen from me. "I think I finally let go of the anger," I admitted. "Not the boundaries, those are permanent. Not the caution, that's wisdom. But the anger, the hurt, the feeling of betrayal, I let it go. Holding on to it was only hurting me, and I'm tired of hurting." Helen pulled me into a fierce hug. "Good for you, honey, good for you. That's the hardest work there is, forgiveness, but it looks like it suits you." Dorothy's journey from heartbreak to healing is almost complete, but there's one final surprise that will bring tears to your eyes. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the powerful conclusion to this incredible story. Margaret called a few days later with unexpected news. "Dorothy, I received a letter from Richard Morrison. He'd like to meet with you if you're willing. He says he has something important to discuss." I was immediately wary. What could Sienna's father possibly need to say that hadn't already been said? But curiosity won out, and I agreed to meet him at Margaret's office, neutral territory with my advocate present. Richard Morrison looked older than I remembered from our brief phone conversations, his face lined with the weight of having a child in federal prison. But his eyes were kind, sad, but genuine as he shook my hand. "Mrs. Harlan, Dorothy, thank you for meeting with me," he began, settling into the chair across from me in Margaret's conference room. "I'll get straight to the point. I've spent the past few months doing a lot of soul-searching about how I raised Sienna, where I went wrong, and I've made some decisions." He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "This is a trust I've established in your name. $250,000, to be used however you see fit. Security, therapy, travel, anything. It's not payment because there's no payment adequate for what my daughter tried to do to you. It's acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that I failed to raise a decent human being, and that failure nearly cost you everything." I stared at the documents, shocked into silence. Margaret picked them up, reviewing them with her trained eye. "Mr. Morrison, this is extraordinarily generous, but..." He held up his hand, stopping her. "Please, I need to do this. I need to know that something good came from this nightmare, that Dorothy has resources to rebuild, to feel secure, to live without fear. My daughter is where she belongs, getting the help she should have gotten decades ago. But Dorothy was an innocent victim, and I can't change what happened, but I can do this." His voice cracked. "I'm a father who failed. Let me at least do this one thing right." I looked at this man, this father carrying a burden I understood too well, the weight of a child's choices, the question of what you could have done differently. "Mr. Morrison," I said gently, "I'll accept this gift, but only if you accept something from me. You didn't fail as a father any more than I failed as a mother. We both raised children who made choices, and sometimes those choices break our hearts. But you've been accountable. You've taken action. You've tried to make things right. That's all any parent can do." He looked at me with tears in his eyes, and I saw in him the same painful journey I'd been on, learning to separate our identity from our children's actions, learning to forgive ourselves for things we couldn't control. That evening, I called Brandon and told him about the meeting with Richard Morrison. "Mom, you don't have to accept his money," Brandon said immediately. "You don't owe him anything." I smiled at his protectiveness, so different from the person who'd once felt entitled to my resources. "I'm accepting it," I told him. "Not because I need it, but because he needs to give it. And I've decided what I'm going to do with it.
I'm going to establish a foundation, the Gerald Harlan Foundation, to help elderly victims of financial abuse and manipulation. We'll provide legal assistance, counseling, security services, everything I needed and was fortunate enough to afford. But not everyone is that fortunate. Brandon was quiet for a moment. Then his voice came through thick with emotion. Dad would have loved that. He always wanted to help people, to make a difference. I felt warmth spread through my chest. I know, and this way something good comes from all the pain. Sienna wanted to destroy me, to take everything I had. Instead, what she did will end up helping hundreds of other people protect themselves. That feels like justice, not revenge, but justice. We talked for another hour, planning the foundation, discussing how Brandon could be involved if he wanted, not as my heir or beneficiary, but as a volunteer, someone with firsthand experience of how manipulation works. The foundation launched 3 months later, with Margaret serving as the legal advisor and Dr. Vance on the advisory board. Our first client was a 78-year-old man whose son had been draining his bank accounts for years. With our help, he got a restraining order, reclaimed his finances, and reconnected with grandchildren the son had kept from him. Seeing him smile, seeing him regain his dignity and autonomy, it made everything I'd been through feel purposeful. Pain can either break you or break you open, Dr. Vance had once said. I'd been broken open, and through that opening, something new and meaningful had grown. Brandon threw himself into the foundation work with surprising passion. He started a support group at Meadowbrook for seniors dealing with difficult family situations, using his own story as an example of how family members can lose their way, but also find it again. Grace attended one of the first meetings and told me afterwards, "Your son is doing important work. He's giving these people hope that their children might change, but also permission to protect themselves even if they don't. That's a gift." I watched Brandon with these elderly people, patient, compassionate, genuinely invested in their well-being, and I saw the man I'd always hoped he'd become. He'd taken the worst experience of his life and transformed it into service to others. A year to the day after Sienna's arrest, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, getting ready for the foundation's first annual fundraiser. I looked at my reflection. 75 years old now, my hair more silver than brown, lines on my face that told stories of joy and sorrow, survival and triumph. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, the one who'd received that devastating phone call about being excluded from her son's wedding. That woman had been broken by the betrayal. But this woman, the one looking back at me now, had been forged into something stronger through the breaking. I'd learned my worth wasn't dependent on my relationship with my son. I'd learned to set boundaries and enforce them. I'd learned that survival sometimes requires standing alone, but healing can include letting people back in. Cautiously, wisely, with clear expectations. The fundraiser was held at a beautiful venue overlooking the river, and as I walked in with Brandon at my side, I was struck by how far we'd come. He looked handsome in his suit, proud to be there, proud to be my son. No longer the entitled man demanding my villa, but a partner in creating something meaningful. The room filled with supporters, Margaret, Helen, Dr. Vance, people from Meadowbrook, donors who believed in our mission, and even a few clients we'd helped, now thriving and wanting to give back. As I stood to speak, thanking everyone for their support, I caught Brandon's eye. He was crying but smiling, and he mouthed 2 words, "Thank you."
I thought about Gerald then, wished he could see this moment. But in a way, I knew he did. He'd built this foundation with me through the values he'd instilled, the love he'd shown, the example he'd set of how to live with integrity. And he'd given me Brandon, who, despite losing his way for a time, had found his way back. The road had been painful, marked by betrayal and fear, manipulation and threat, but we'd survived it. More than survived, we'd been transformed by it. I'd gained a deeper understanding of myself, a stronger sense of my own worth, a clearer vision of what I wanted my legacy to be. and Brandon had gained the humility and wisdom that only comes from facing your worst self and choosing to be better. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Brandon and I stood on the balcony overlooking the river, watching the water reflect the city lights. "Mom," he said quietly, "I know I say this a lot, but I need to say it again. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for holding firm to your boundaries, for making me face consequences, for refusing to enable my terrible behavior. If you'd just forgiven me easily, if you'd let me use the villa, if you'd accepted my treatment of you, I'd still be that person. You saved me by refusing to save me. Does that make sense?" I nodded, feeling tears prick my eyes. It makes perfect sense. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is let their child fail, let them face the natural consequences of their actions. It's the hardest thing, but sometimes it's necessary. We stood in comfortable silence for a while. Then Brandon said, "I have something for you. I was going to wait until Christmas, but this feels like the right moment." He pulled out a small wrapped box from his jacket pocket. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with 2 charms, a rose and a key. "The rose is for you," he explained. "Strong, beautiful, with thorns that protect. And the key is to remind you that you hold the keys to your own life, your home, your villa, your heart, your boundaries. No one gets access unless you grant it. Not even me, especially not me. I need to earn that access every single day through respect and love and consistent action." I fastened the necklace around my neck, feeling the weight of the charms against my skin, symbols of everything I'd learned and everything I'd become. As we drove home that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 2 years ago, I'd been devastated by my son's betrayal, terrified by his fiancé's threats, questioning everything I'd done as a mother. Now, I was running a foundation that held people, I had a relationship with my son that was healthier than it had ever been, and I understood myself in ways I never had before. The villa in Carmel was still mine, a place of peace now rather than contention. My boundaries were clear and respected. My life had meaning that extended far beyond being someone's mother or widow. I was Dorothy Harlan, 75 years old, and I was enough. Complete. Whole. Exactly as I was. That night, as I prepared for bed, I did something I hadn't done since the nightmare began. I pulled out the photo album from my wedding day and looked at young Gerald smiling at the camera, at young Dorothy in her simple white dress, both of them so full of hope and love. "We did okay," I whispered to his image. "Our son lost his way, but he found it again, and I found myself in the process. We did okay, Gerald. We really did." I placed the album back on the shelf, turned off the light, and climbed into bed. For the first time in 2 years, I fell asleep immediately, deeply, without fear or anxiety or regret. Just peace. Just gratitude. Just the quiet contentment of knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, I could handle it. I'd proven that to myself. And that was the greatest gift of all. Thank you for joining Dorothy on this incredible journey from heartbreak to healing. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's possible to survive betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. Remember, your worth is not defined by how others treat you, but by how you treat yourself. Set those boundaries, know your value, and never let anyone, not even family, diminish your dignity. Dorothy's story shows us that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, and it's never too late for healing and redemption. In the meantime, on the final screen, I'm leaving you with 2 of the channel's most beloved stories. I'm sure they will surprise you.
Thank you for staying with me until now.